recording in progress. Right, so let's share my screen and get going. So leading and transforming with outcomes. Larry promised a powerful talk. What he didn't know is that I rewrote the talk today, so this might be a total disaster. I hope not. I don't think so. Leading and transforming with outcomes. Really the emphasis on the outcomes, but I hope by the end of the talk as well, you'll understand why leadership and transformation have a close relationship with outcomes as well, or they can be, and it's a very powerful way of approaching leadership and transformation is through outcomes, and explains why I've written at least two of my 3 books. It explains also why we launched the Agendashift Academy about a year ago now. Leadership and strategy for the transforming organization, and there's a clue there about what ties it all together. And it's actually the strategy word is the way we tie leadership, strategy, transformation, outcomes, all of that. And it's aimed at leaders in transforming organizations. Words I chose quite carefully, leaders in transforming organizations, but it should apply to most of you, many of your colleagues, your clients, and so on. And we really are, seeking to bring outcome orientation to leadership, in industry around the world. So author 3 books, right to left, oldest first, Kanban from the Inside, published in 2014. That was the end result of a blog post that changed my career, introducing Kanban through its values. Still, embarrassingly, still my most read blog post from all those years old, 9 years old now. In that blog post, I explained Kanban in a different way through a model of 9 different values. So transparency, balance, collaboration, the first 3, customer focus, flow, leadership, second 3, and then 3 that are really expanding on leadership, understanding, agreement, and respect. And then not long after publishing the book, I kind of moved to the side of the Kanban community. I had something else I really needed to do. I knew that there was a job to be done in the area of change and transformation that wasn't focused on one particular framework. So I wrote the first edition of Agendashift that was published in 2018. Then Right to Left, that was an outcome-oriented view of the Lean Agile landscape, really written for leaders. That came out in 2019. And then once we were all locked down with COVID, I turned that into an audiobook. And then the second edition of Agendashift is coming up to a year old now. We have just learned in the 3 years between the 2 editions, we just learned so much, lots of practice. There's lots of people in the broader community, in the partner community, using this stuff and refining it. And also, we've done a lot of work, really digging some deep down foundations down to the theory. And you'll see, you'll see that if you read that second edition, you'll see, that in terms of from organization development, organizational psychology, and various other places, management cybernetics even, various models that really help to explain how Agendashift works and helped us to improve it as well. So enough sort of introduction about me and my stuff. Let's talk about you, or perhaps more your organizations. So many organizations are distracted. I mean, really badly distracted, dysfunctionally so. Distracted in 3 main ways. The first of them, and perhaps the most important of these, is distracted by solutions. They keep choosing big solutions to solve their problems. You go through all that pain of rolling those solutions out, and at the end of the process, they are almost always disappointing. It happens time and again, and it happens for so many different kinds of things. It happens, with things like technologies, with processes, with applications, with agile frameworks, whatever. Organizations totally distracted by the solutions and forgetting what it was they were trying to achieve by choosing them in the first place, which is dysfunctional. Second thing they get distracted by is activity. It is very easy to confuse activity, how busy we are, with progress. And organizations actually forget how to measure their progress. They forget to define it in meaningful terms, terms that people can respond to, and so on. And so it's, heads down, plowing through the backlogs, all that kind of thing, and mistaking all that activity for something meaningful being achieved. And the last thing we get distracted by, and it goes with the solutions one as well, we get distracted by structure. I'll say a bit more about this one at the end, but it's very easy to focus on the things that have been formalized, things like organization structures and processes and things like that, and lose sight actually of what's important. So those are three ways that we're distracted. Now, to respond to those, three what I call meta strategies, that's a very fancy word, but strategies for improving how you do strategy, improving how you develop strategy, improve how you act on strategy. And don't worry, this isn't above your pay grade. This does apply to everyone. It applies to every Agile team and so on, for reasons I will expand on towards the end. So if we're distracted by solutions, what's the strategy? And it is to keep asking this question. This is a question I've been asking now for the past 6 years. What if we put agreement on outcomes before solutions? So authentic agreement, so that means the right people in the room. That's everybody, or people at least, very representative of people who are going to need to be involved in change, agreeing on outcomes well before they agree on solutions. These are outcomes they can organize around, outcomes that can be goals, can be objectives, outcomes that might just be the impact of a small change, a small experiment, outcomes that might be measures of progress, measures of success, key performance indicators, anything like that, but agree on outcomes before we agree solutions. Now, you might realize that that's actually a 180-degree turnaround from the way change usually happens. So usually we use outcomes to sell solutions, usually solutions that are the wrong scale, usually too big. And then we live with all that pain and disappointment afterwards. Put outcomes first, and especially agreement on outcomes. Make sure it's authentic. We're not just selling. We're not using this just to sell solutions to people. Then solutions start to emerge from the people closest to the problem. People who have ownership of those outcomes that they've articulated themselves. In lean terms, you can think of this as pull rather than push. And it is a fundamentally different way of going about doing change. Now, this is where the conversational bit happens. We're actually going to practice some of that. But before we actually practice having a conversation about outcomes, a little reflection for you. So I'm going to read this out. So imagine everyone able to work consistently at their ideal best. Individuals, teams, between teams, across the organization and beyond. Right people, right conversation, right people, best possible moment. Needs anticipated, met at just the right time. Just want you to enjoy that for a moment and think about what different parts of that you respond to, or the thing as a whole. What kind of picture does that paint for you? And more formally, a question actually I'd love to hear some answers to. So when all of that is working at its ideal best for us, what's that like? So what's that like? And the floor is open. What's that like?
Is that even possible?
Is that even possible? Yes. Well, it's your chance to use your imagination. What are you capable of imagining?
I actually, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
This is Rachel. I've actually seen this happen several years ago on a team where we had all of this, only once in my 30+ year career, but the outcome of it was that we were all empowered. We were allowed to make the decisions we needed to. Yep. Those decisions were made at the front line level, and therefore the what we were doing was realistic. confident. We needed clarity to make sure that we were on the right path. But once we had that, people got out of our way and we accomplished a lot.
Sounds fantastic.
And I'm going to piggyback off of what Rachel said.
Yes.
I think of empowerment as an input, not an outcome, right? Empowerment should be an input to a system of people or a system of value that is there kind of at the front end to enable like the best kind of outcomes possible. So similar to Rachel in my career here, I've been blessed to be on a couple teams like this, and there is just an undercurrent on these teams of like possibility, right?
Yeah.
Like no challenge is too big. Everybody's willing to step out of their own comfort zone. They're empowered, and just more gets done. Like more gets achieved when people are happy.
Yeah. So can I ask, for those of you that haven't experienced anything close to this, what does this evoke for you? And perhaps while you're thinking about that, I'll tell a little story. I did this years ago now at a internationally known non-profit. It's one that you will have heard of. I'm not going to say who it was. Internationally known non-profit with a very noble purpose, one that every member of staff completely bought into. But for them, having this conversation was absolutely amazing. It was cathartic. They wanted more and more time for this reflection, for the conversations around it, because the way things actually worked wasn't working for them. Their work was actually incredibly frustrating, noble as it was. Now, however much they cared about what they were trying to do, it was incredibly frustrating. Nothing happened when it should have happened. Things that should took minutes, hours, days took, weeks, months, years. Incredibly frustrating. And so for them, it was actually wonderful just to imagine what it could be like, and giving them the permission to think about what it could be like. So let's just have one more. I mean, who responds to this and thinking, well, wow, that would be fantastic if we could have it, and what does it evoke for you? Which bits do you most respond to? Well, don't worry if you can't answer that one. I'm going to go back to Rachel.
Well, I can, Mike, but I do a lot of talking, so.
That's okay. Well, I'm actually going to pick on you and Chris.
You are, okay.
So when either in your experience or in those examples where it wasn't working as well, but you can imagine your way towards this, whose needs are you meeting? What new stories could you tell if you got things closer to this? Actually, Rachel, your other example might be a good one for this. Whose needs would we be meeting if we did this better? What new stories could we tell? What could they tell?
Customer satisfaction.
Yeah. Open,
honest transparency. Confidence and realistic commitments.
Yeah, that all sounds good.
They're confident. I apologize. I'll jump in also. To me, I would envision our members would be able to express confidence in their financial strength.
Yep. And when you get these things right, then a whole lot of other, consequences follow. Business consequences follow, don't they? Well, I'm going to move on. Just very quickly, very direct question. What stops that? What gets in the way?
So I'll jump into this. Things that get in the way are, I would say, competing models that an organization is trying to apply concurrently.
Yep.
Right. So there's an HR structure, there's an agile structure, there might be a chapter structure, there might be a discipline structure.
Yep.
And I've seen very often in multiple structures, enterprise structures, where if one group of people is holding on super tight to the HR hierarchy and one group of people is holding on super tight to maybe a discipline or a chapter, and another group of people is holding on very tightly to this agile model, it's very difficult for everyone to come together and collaborate on sort of shared objectives and priorities and really understand what the collective value is. And I've seen that happen where if we can't agree on collective value, those pieces break off and do their own thing, and we lack a lot of shared synergies.
Yes, well, you're actually raising a whole lot of issues we'll come to later, which is interesting. So let's go straight from that one obstacle to so why is that obstacle important?
So I would jump in and say, and I don't view it as an obstacle. I view it as a constraint. Different constraints, and the constraints are usually important because they either keep us compliant or they keep us within best practices, or they keep us within identified allocations of funding and so on.
Okay. So perhaps this one is to Chris. So where it is or was an obstacle, what would you like to have happen?
So I agree with Michael that sometimes there's systems we have to just live with, right? In the concept of change management and moving people along an agile journey, or any kind of journey for any model that you would want to do, you have to understand what is difficult to move and what isn't, right? So
Yep.
I think HR hierarchies are always going to be there, right? But that doesn't preclude the fact that we do need to come together and create a shared vision and a shared set of priorities on behalf of the product, the customer, the product, right? So as far as like how this manifests as a difficulty, is that there's a lot of role confusion. There's a lot of not understanding who does what, when, and where, and why. And there's an immediate impact on our ability to deliver on value. So what I would have liked to have happened is, I would say, having a really strong leader in place who can bring people together, a really strong change manager who can bring people together despite of the different constraints inside the system, and make it work, and ultimately envision a journey along the path to get us to where that making it work isn't so hard.
So when you get people together and make it work, then what happens?
I think you see success in your outcomes. Trying to get folks to buy in is the most complex portion of this, because you can't get everyone having the right conversations or taking the right steps or the right approaches without having them agree that it is in fact the appropriate way to approach development or products.
Okay. Yeah, Rachel?
I was just going to add that if you have a message, which is normally a strategic message, a strategic objective, and you ask 5 different leaders from 5 different organizations to share that one strategic objective, you're getting 5 different interpretations, and you're getting allegiance to 5 different organizations.
Yep.
So when Chris was saying you need that strong leader, that is one leader on top of that initiative, regardless of where they are in the hierarchy, sending that message down and making sure that their leaders are sending that same message down.
And
But that's not what happens.
If it's not leaders doing it, it has to be everyone buying into the same message, right? So it's either a leader
right,
pushing a
now
message.
we're onto something. So when everyone buys into that one message, and I want to say, that doesn't necessarily even need to come from the top. It might have been one that has been developed through conversation. When you have that shared message that everyone understands, then what happens?
I think you get a really strong, motivated team that can really make a difference to achieving that goal. And once that happens, it creates a lot of enthusiasm for others to be a part of it in the organization, right?
One other challenge that I want to bring up quickly is the telephone game.
Yep.
And what our leaders say versus what the people that are actually executing the work are doing, right? There's that middle, that frozen middle, whatever you want to call it, that has ties into their scorecard. What is important for them to succeed at their level? What are their own personal motivations? And sometimes they might know what that vision is, but they also have other responsibilities that they are also beholden to that shift that. And so if you were to go and ask a leader, our CEO or one of the presidents from each one of the different coasts, what is the message you're giving? Have you confirmed it with the actual people executing the work? Have we ever done that kind of confirmation? And what we'll see is that there's probably a difference in what is being said to what is actually being done. And so because there's that difference, there's a huge disconnect and a huge cause for confusion. Like, what am I supposed to do? Do I do this? Do I do that? So that misinterpretation, that telephone
Yes.
game is a real problem for a lot of enterprises that are large at scale.
Putting words in your mouth, I mean, we don't have agreements on outcomes, you know, at least not anything meaningful. We've got different understandings of what it is we're trying to do. I'm going to close that there and just sort of summarize how that conversation actually worked. So we started with that reflection, you know, what's that like? Whose needs are we meeting? What new stories could we tell? And so on. We're beginning to paint our own pictures of some kind of idealized, compelling future. It doesn't have to be with that true north statement I provided. There are lots of ways of beginning a conversation that takes us towards something, a compelling version of where we are now, or a compelling version of what it is we want to talk about, what we're trying to achieve. Then what obstacles are in the way of all of that, and then turn those obstacles into outcomes. I think we went back to obstacles after we started talking about outcomes, which is quite often how these conversations go. But that's okay. That's we'll talk in a moment about fluency in the language of outcomes. And it's harder for us here because we're all from different places. We don't share the same context. We don't all encounter the same challenges every day. We don't know each other well enough to, you know, have an idea of what different outcomes people want to achieve, and so on. But even so, even like in a public forum, you can lead people through this kind of conversation. With just a little bit more preparation, rather than me being holding the conversation from the front here as the facilitator, I can instead be the host, and you have these conversations in breakouts, you know, in table groups, and we'll see what different groups have to say. You know, it's not just one person, whether it's me, the facilitator, or somebody else dominating the whole conversation. So we can use all the tools of facilitation as well to help us do that. Now, to turn this really into an effective strategy conversation, and this is what we lack doing this in a meetup, is getting everyone on the same page in terms of what our context is. You know, who are we? What are we about? What is the challenge that we face? Those kinds of questions. And that really does help to set up a more effective ideal obstacles outcomes conversation. We call this the I do pattern. So it started as a structure that I recognized in many of my sort of strings of exercises that I do. But actually, it's also the pattern for a conversation that took, in our case, a few minutes. But you could imagine as a quick leadership routine, you know, what are we trying to achieve? What would great look like? What's in the way of that? What would you like to have happen? You know, that takes moments. You know, it's a very simple pattern to learn. And then the trick is to organize the results of those conversations. You know, the big danger in the end of the meeting is to say, well, what are our next steps? And you agree a next step, and then 90% of what you talked about just disappeared forever. You know, if you can find ways to organize the results of those conversations, then you know, you really are turning into strategies. You can use things like, you know, OKR and mapping and things like that. So that fluency I talked about is knowing what kinds of questions will lead us towards any of the ideal obstacles or outcomes. If I ask, why is something important? That tends to take us in the direction of the ideal. If I ask what stops that, what gets in the way, obviously obstacles. You can talk about obstacles to the ideal, you can talk about obstacles to the outcome. What first signs of success might we see? You know, or what first signs that we're overcoming the obstacle might we see? You know, those are ways to going towards outcomes, and many more questions like that. And we basically, we've used this pattern to organize a whole load of tools that are about understanding our context better, having some great conversations about our context, and then various coaching tools, things like challenge mapping, solutions focus, clean language, liberating structures, that's facilitation, but you get the idea. And using the ideal obstacles outcomes pattern to help us generate stuff that we can organize into strategy with OKR, mapping, A3, all those kinds of tools. So quickly looking at the time, I should move on. That was meta strategy 1. Keep asking that question, and I really urge you to keep asking this question: what if we put agreement on outcomes before solutions? The next time you hear you catch yourself about to recommend a solution before you've really had a conversation about outcomes, ask that question of yourself. Try to change your teams, train your teams to ask these questions, before we get too far down to a solution that in the end is going to disappoint. So that's what to do if you're distracted by solutions. Now, if you're distracted by activity, confusing activity and busyness for progress, what's the meta strategy here? How can we get better at strategy? And this is more about acting on strategy than developing it now. And the strategy is to keep outcomes in the foreground. That means whenever you get together to talk about what you've been doing, talk about your work, try to make it about the outcomes. And there's two tricks that really, really help. So the first one is to keep reminding yourselves, keep reminding each other that you're only done when a need has been met. And that means retaining ownership of the work until you can demonstrate that a need has been met. And then the second one is you're really done only when you've fully accounted for the learning. So just to drill down on those. So that first one, in meme form, my definition of done, someone's need was met. Deliberately provocative. I get like a 9 to 1, 10 to 1 response to this. Most people get what I'm trying to do, get the joke. A few people really insulted, really appalled that I've subverted a cherished concept of the definition of done. But whose need? What need? How do we know that we've met it? And those are the kind of questions you ask before you worry about, well, how are we going to meet it? Yeah. And then keeping that ownership of it until it's done. And we can visualize this in Kanban terms. Now I can explain this in Scrum terms as well, but we don't have the time for that. But in Kanban terms, the things that are done are the things on the right. And if you're good at Kanban, you probably know you work right to left in Kanban. You start with the things that are done. Are they going to stay done? What we're learning from them, if they're in production, for example, what we're learning about them. And then we work backwards. What can we get over the line? What can we unblock? What can we move forward, creating some more capacity for further work and so on. And we are, by focusing on the things on the right first, and always reminding ourselves what done means, we are achieving that first point. We're done when needs have been met. And when do you take things off the board? So you take things off the board when the learning has been fully accounted for. So and that means in well-designed meetings where you're doing things like tracking your KPIs, understanding how the work you've done is impacting those KPIs, looking at your experiments in right to left order. What have we learned from the experiments that are completed? What do we think we're learning from the experiments in progress? What do we hope to learn from the things we're planning, and so on? So that's that right to left idea as a way of looking back over the last few weeks or whatever of work. So I've very broad brush terms described a particular kind of delivery review that you can do, and that's described in detail in the right to left book. You can describe this in Scrum terms as well. I mean, in Scrum, you're changing it from plowing through backlogs left to right to shared objectives pursued goal by goal. So this is what I'm doing in the right to left book, is just looking at all the frameworks from an outcome oriented perspective, and it helps to integrate them, see how they work with each other, complement each other, and so on. So that's
Mike,
yes.
May I ask a quick question before
Please
you
do.
move on that? Really a statement, because I was confused, but now I think I've got it, and I just want you to say, yes,
Yeah.
you got it. In your second bullet, when you say you're really done when you've accounted for the learning, you mean the feedback learning that has caused us to now have to do some sort of modification to really meet that need. And so originally I was just confused by that.
Yeah, well, it might or might not involve a modification, but what do we learn about our customer? when we saw them respond to us meeting their need? What do we learn about our product in the process of doing it? What do we learn about ourselves in the process of doing it? And perhaps most importantly of all, were there any assumptions that we made at the beginning of the work that now we learn aren't true? And that's the real mark of learning, that you're prepared to have your assumptions tested, have them challenged, and are prepared to update them from time to time. So you know you've got a real forum for learning when that kind of thing is happening. Yeah, that was a
So
very
it's
good
kind of
question.
like the realization of the final feedback loop.
Yes, yes, it's double loop learning. Yeah, if you're making your assumptions open to challenge. Yeah, yeah. Good. So that's meta strategy number 2. What to do when you're distracted by activity. Now, distracted by structure, that's a much more subtle one. The issue here, and actually some of the things that Chris was talking about go to this. It's very easy to be distracted by the things that have been formalized. They're the most easy things to see. So you're talking about things like organization structure, process designs, and so on. And the big trap here is that you can think that strategy only relates to those things. And the big trap and the big irony for Agile is that you think of strategy either that's something that comes from the left-hand side of the process and input to the process, or you think of strategy as something that comes from above. And the big irony of Agile is it talks a lot about autonomous teams, but doesn't help them develop strategies of their own. And I don't know how you can claim autonomy when strategy is something that happens to you. It comes from the left or comes from above. And if you're working with teams, if you lead a team, if you have the means to help teams think about strategy themselves, you are starting to do something about that. And the strategy here, the meta strategy here, is to think about where strategy happens. Think less in terms of process and hierarchy, the things that are very formalized, and start to think in terms of 2 things, identity and circles. Those are both quite subtle things, but I'll visualize that for you in a moment. And there's one of those questions to keep asking. And the question is, who's invited? This is we are trying. What all of this about, in fact, is about trying to make strategy something that is participatory, that engages people. Yeah. So this picture comes from a case study of mine. It's again from the Right to Left book. It's from a real example. I was working in government digital at the time. I've taken the names off and so on. But thinking in circles. So what's a circle? Now there is formal definitions of it, but I'm thinking just informally to start with. Where can people easily and frequently interact with each other in a way that's purposeful, that achieves things, and so on? So you can think of things like teams. You can think about small groups within teams. You can think about, Chris mentioned communities of practice. All those things there, and they are cross-cutting, some of these things. People can belong to more than one circle. They may be in one circle because of the specialism that they have. They may be in another circle because of the customer that they serve. All sorts of reasons for people to be in circles. And the trick is to recognize you've got people that interact easily and interact purposefully. And you recognize these circles, recognize these groups of people. And the question to ask now is, would this circle benefit from having a stronger sense of identity, a stronger sense of purpose, and a strategy of its own? And what might happen if it had a strategy of its own? And what we're inviting them to do is to have their own conversations about strategy, and they can use all the tools that we have to help them do that. We could facilitate that for them, or just say, it's up to you. You see, let's see what you come up with. Now that will horrify some people, because now this team is coming up with a strategy that might, diverge from the strategy of the group as a whole. But this is the classic tension in organization, in management. Your framework for understanding how organizations work is useless if it doesn't help you manage the tension between autonomy and coherence. And this actually does. And notice that 3 out of the 4 people in this circle are actually members of other circles. If these 4 people had their own strategy conversation, they would be representing most of the rest of the department. You know, it's actually okay. What they're doing is coming up with a strategy for a particular domain, for a particular concern. You know, it shouldn't, if people are doing the right, you know, the job they should do in terms of representing their other circles, it shouldn't have a negative impact on the organization as a whole. But if it does, that's something we can actually address. So let's look now at the people that are in more than one circle. These are the linchpins. Is there enough happening between the circles? And if there isn't, we can ask, well, what can we do to encourage conversations to be easier, more productive, more frequent, more purposeful? And you can do that for any pair of circles, or you could do it for the organization as a whole. These, or everybody, let's make sure that we're meeting frequently enough, having the conversations we need to have that are, you know, about our purpose, what we're trying to achieve, and so on. I mean, very often you get a lot of these things for free. And if you're doing Scrum, you're doing SAFe, you're doing anything with a regular rhythm of meetings, make sure that those meetings are being done effectively. But you can do it at those smaller levels as well, but in circles, between circles, and so on. So we're addressing the coherence part as well. And that in the end means the group as a whole having a strategy. Everything I said about one little circle applies to the big circle as well. So it is the best of both worlds, autonomy and coherence. So meta strategy 3, think less in terms of formal structures, think more in terms of identity. Wherever you've got groups of people that share something in common, seem to have some purpose together. Think in circles, and think about how they overlap and what particular domains they're responsible for. And you can think about empowering them to have responsibility for those domains. So that's the third of the 3 meta strategies. So just wrapping up, organizations, they are incredibly distracted, many of them, probably yours, by solutions, activity, or structure. And 3, apologies for the animation here, it's gone wrong, 3 meta strategies to help you get better at strategy, at developing strategy and acting on it. So keep asking that question, what if we put agreement on outcomes? Keep outcomes in the foreground, have a real strong sense of done, someone's need being met, have a real sense of really done. You know, we've accounted for all the learning we can. We framed the work for learning. We're open to challenging our assumptions. We're serious about challenging our assumptions. And lastly, think about where the strategy happens. Think in terms of participation, think in terms of engagement, think in terms of circles, who's invited. So that was leading and transforming with outcomes. I hope you got at least a beginning of a sense of how leadership, transformation, and strategy can be, and I think should be, intimately related with each other. Just before I open up for questions, a very quick commercial break at the end. Some of you know this already. I'm spending this year rolling out Leading with Outcomes. So it's a mixture of self-paced training and workshop-based interactive experience, shall we say. And the foundation module of that, that's at the bottom here, that launched a month ago. So that is already live. And you can see here the kinds of things that we cover. So inside out strategy. So let's have some conversations, you know, about developing strategy that are about start with our experience, our capability, how we can be fitter, how we can be fit for maximum impact, as we like to say. And there's outside in strategy, that strategy that starts with your customers, your competitors, other stakeholders, and then your products, you know, organization, products, and so on, working your way in and thinking about the implications for all that. And you can see how that maps to all those circles and things like that as well. Adaptive organization, that's a bit more of the theory of organization, and then innovating for performance, how we come up with ideas to actually put those outcomes into action. And kind of the curriculum as a whole reflects the structure of the foundation module. So that's available now at the Agendashift Academy, academy.agendashift.com. That, I think, is that from me. I'm very easy to find, agendashift.com/Mike. Do get in touch, connect with me on LinkedIn. There's a Slack community. Some of you are members already, agendashift.com/Slack. There's also an Agendashift LinkedIn group. And it is very much, it has been a lot of collaboration, a lot of community work has gone into making this what it is, and we never stand still for long. As I said at the beginning, I rewrote this talk today. Those 3 meta strategies, those are quite new. They were in the blog just a couple of weeks ago. Defined it in different terms previously in terms of principles, for example. But I'm playing with these at the moment, and you were my first victims. So thank you very much. I will stop sharing my screen. If there are questions, love to hear them. I might find some on Slack. In chat. Larry, I don't know if you've been looking at chat. Do we have any questions there that we should be answering?
Wait, I did not see any questions other than folks putting comments as the conversation was going on. I do have a quick question. You did mention just towards the end that you posted some information on your blog. How do people get to your blog?
Oh, that is blog.agendashift.com. So I'll put some of the main links there. Blog.agendashift.com. I mentioned Slack, agendashift.com/Slack. Always seems a hard thing to say. And then the academy.agendashift.com.
Thank you. Did anybody have any questions they want to offer up?
Oh, and subscribe as well. Why not? There's
a
list, which I know that's already been used by one person already today. One person here today. Subscribe.
I, of course, have a question.
There you go. Yes, go ahead.
So I was very intrigued by the circle diagram and the autonomous identification of strategy. So my question is, what would you recommend when those autonomous strategies endanger delivery of shared priorities?
Yep. Well, it goes back. Well, you have to go backwards and think, well, how was that allowed to happen in the first place? Two answers really. First of all, if something's gone wrong in strategy, the first question I ask is, well, who was invited? And were the right people represented? And the second part is, well, you still got the accountability for learning as well. You know, you should have, for this to work really effectively, you do need those regular reviews. And the trick here, I mean, this is a bit beyond the scope of the talk, but the trick is to go outside in. So the review actually starts with customer. If you're doing it by circle, you do it by the circle closest to the customer first. So it might be customer support, might be the first few things that we talk about. Then it might be the product team. Then it might be, an engineering team, so on. You're working your way in. And what that does, you're starting typically with the agenda item that is most about your overall goals. And then if you go from one layer to the next, one circle to the next, and you just can't see the relationship, but why are you doing this when we're trying to achieve that? And that's a question that you can have there. It shouldn't get to that, obviously. But there are some tricks of meeting design that do actually help to promote alignment without having to be heavy about it. It's kind of natural, and so right to left, I mentioned, most complete first is a good trick for meetings, and not just Kanban meetings. You can do that with anything where you've got a list of stuff to go through. But outside in is another really good trick. to start closest to the customer first. Start closest to your purpose first, if that's too specific for you, and work your way inwards. And you can think about how can we have the updates in such an order that the alignment should be natural. Yeah, and outside in is a good summary of that.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Any more? I don't mind hard questions, by the way. They're usually the best.
Mike, maybe just a quick one from me. You know, it's thank you for that. I think it's a great topic, and as you read through the book as well. So, what would you recommend? You know, to create more evidence. For example, you're trying to create this autonomy and coherence in an existing established organization, and you want to pilot something new. How do you go about to creating evidence that this pattern that you want to, you know, show potentially has value beyond just the pilot, and this could be broadly implemented? So
yes. Well, I called it thinking in circles rather than organizing in circles. So for me, there is a formal model this is leaning on, and that is sociocracy, which is actually an operating model, a governance model. But long before I was using it as a governance model, it was just like a lens on the organization that we actually had already. You know, I could see there were these natural clusters of people. I was really intrigued by the fact, when I looked closely enough, that there were some people that were closely involved with multiple of these circles. So, a very concrete, obvious example, we had a UX guy who was a member both of the product circle and the technology circle. You know, in both worlds, sort of both at the same time. And it meant that when you're having a technology conversation, there's at least one representative of the product world. When you're having a product conversation, there's at least one representative of the technology world. I just noticed that, and I was intrigued by it. And you know, as part of my research was it for Right to Left, or no, it was for Right to Left, because John Buck, who wrote a really good book on sociocracy, actually wrote the foreword to Right to Left. So yes, I was intrigued to find, when sociocracy is based on, you know, circles for domains, people join circles by consent, and circles are governed by consent. That's pretty much it. It's not democracy. It's not consensus. It's by consent. You know, we're going, okay, that's good enough for now, safe enough to try. You know, that's governing by consent. And I found, in, you know, when I looked back on that case study, that yes, that was actually true. Circles did their own hiring, and on rare and sad occasions, they had to lose people as well. But it was all done with consent, and very much self-governing in each of those circles. You know, really, each discipline able to give of its best, and develop themselves, work with you know, their respective communities of interest and all the rest of it. You know, that it was almost too good to be true. It was just the correspondence was fantastic. But I really believe in, you know, if you believe in things like identity, purpose, developing strategy locally, and all the rest of it, as I do, you know, it's a very, you know, that's a very, I think actually very 21st century thing. It's what people want. It's what people expect. You know, servant leadership, I think, you know, leads to this kind of thing. Host leadership leads to this kind of thing. Let's give people the opportunity to make some decisions for themselves, and then able to give of their best. But it's not a free for all. It's not completely ad hoc. You know, we do need to share some purpose as well. And you know, in my reading of the theory, you know, there's theory that, you know, decades old, that understands how these things happen in organizations. You know, that clustering of people inside groups is actually very, very normal. I mean, we might think of it something negative, you know, cliques and things like that. But it's natural. If you have an interaction with someone and it's productive, you can have that interaction again. I mean, this is how organizations happen. It's self-organizing, it's natural, you know, and then you can turn the dial up on autonomy with the sort of techniques I described. You can turn the dial up on coherence by being careful to invite people to either focused forums or bigger forums that address any weaknesses in the communication in the organization.
Thank you.
I wonder if you might have any tips or tricks for, I think many of us have worked for, or might even still work for, places where there's like capital A, capital T, agile transformations, thou shalt be agile and thou shalt do it this way.
Yeah.
So the idea that structure, that impediment, or the idea that like we want teams to be informed in strategy, many times that's viewed as, strategy is this group's job and they'll do it. So I'm just curious ways you can maybe invite people to consider it other ways, or maybe not see it as a threat, like things you found.
Yeah, well, I think there's a definite overlap between developing strategy locally and coaching. Coaching isn't telling people what to do. Well, it isn't most of the time. And you are giving a coach, one thing a coach can do is actually help the team understand what options are provided by the framework that's being implemented. Which one would be best for us? How can we make it work for us, and so on. I mean, I've never done it, but I always imagine, it's kind of a joke really, because it's so different to the reality. But imagine a SAFe rollout where you started with the SAFe principles. You asked, imagine that SAFe principle working in its ideal best for us. What stops that? What would we like to have happen? And actually start to, based on the SAFe principles, actually start to improve our organization that way. Now, I don't think any SAFe rollout in the world goes like that. But SAFe does provide a whole load of ready prepared recipes that you can follow. SAFe is too big for you to digest it all in one go. You're going to have to make some choices, and you can help teams choose which is the thing that we're going to work on next, and how can we make it really work for us. That's not how I would like to work. I'd much rather start with, start nearer, higher up in the organization, understanding, actually even higher in the organization is not even the right word. The more levels of organization you can involve in that strategy conversation, the better. I always say at least 3. Then you've got a chance that you've got people who, control budgets, know what the overall objective is, in the room at the same time as people who understand actually how this is going to get done. The more levels you can have represented, the easier these things go. Turn the dial up to 11, you've got open space. Everybody in the room together. That's not always possible. But getting 3 levels of organisation into a room together isn't actually that hard. It's a leadership team plus a representative of each team, for example, or it's a team plus some other stakeholders, for example, even customers. It's been done. You go back to the old, I think the stuff's not online anymore, but you look at a lot of SAFe was influenced by what Rally were doing. And they were doing a whole room strategy with a customer on every table. Yeah, can be done. I got slightly further away from your original question, but I hope I gave you some ideas. Yeah,
for sure. Thanks.
I am watching the time. I know it's your lunch hour, and actually it's my evening as well, and I got something else to go to this evening. But I think we've got time for one more question.
Well, I don't have a question. I'm just going to say, Michael, thank you very much. Thank you. We really did appreciate your presentation today. For those of you who want to find out more about what Mike's all about, look in the chat. He's put in several links out there available to us. I just want to also thank everybody for joining us today, your lunch hour, or in Mike's case, in your dinner hour. Thank you all very much. To be able to see future events that Agile Hartford is going to put together, please look at agilehartford.org. Looking forward to seeing you all at a future event. Have a good day. We'll talk to you all later. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.